In this lesson, we're going to look at the world of African Americans in the new nation. So, we're looking at a time period from about 1783, when the American Revolution ended, to the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The lesson objectives are we're going to describe the forces that, following the American Revolution, worked for African American freedom. We're also going to look at the forces following the American Revolution that worked to maintain slavery. We're going to describe the characteristics of free African American communities. We're going to identify early African American leaders in the United States and their varying ideas, tactics, solutions for the problems African Americans faced. We will also look at African Americans and their role in the War of 1812. And lastly, we're going to look at the Missouri Compromise and how this impacted African Americans. So after the Revolution, there was a strong trend to go towards emancipation of slavery, and this was something that Northerners mostly could wrap their head around because slavery was not an economic. It wasn't economically essential to the North. As we've said before, the climate and the geography and the landscape just wasn't conducive to a having a slave labor force. And so we're going to see Northern emancipation. It's not going to result from force or intervention from perhaps an imperial power. It's going to be from within the people that live there. So some results we're going to see is by 1790, we're going to see that there's no slaves in Massachusetts, and some are even starting to gain the right to vote. We will also see gradual abolition in states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. So, looking at the process of abolition in the North, where we're going to end up is we're going to have complete abolition, and slavery is going to be banned in our New England territories. It's going to get to a point of gradual emancipation for our middle colonies and more of our still in the North. And then you're going to have your southern states, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and southward, are all going to continue to allow slavery. We're also going to see in a little bit this territory, the Northwest Territory, is going to be closed off to slavery. So, one of the things that comes out of the first government that we have in the United States, it's called the Articles of Confederation. And most of the things that the Confederation did not work for our government, but this is going to be one of the things that does work, and that's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So, this new territory that we saw on our last slide, they had to decide, well, how are we going to organize this new chunk of land, and are we going to allow slavery there? So Jefferson, who we commonly know as being a slave owner, somebody that sees African Americans as inferior to white people, he did propose that there's no slavery after 1800 for everything west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. This proposal failed by a single vote. This was a few years before the Northwest Ordinance. So when the Northwest Ordinance came about, it set up an orderly sale of land. It supported public education in this new territory. It set up a territorial government, and it gave rules for how to become states. And part of this Northwest Ordinance also banned slaves. Now, this only applied to the land that was north of the Ohio River. And we're going to see issues about expanding slavery into new territories. This is going to last all the way into the Civil War. Now, mind you, we did have it, even though slavery was outlawed in the Northwest Ordinance, we are going to see in these territories, such as Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, you will see rules where they try to outlaw African Americans settling there. After the American Revolution, we will start to see the emergence of anti slavery societies. And then we will start to see the concepts of manumission, which is that earning that freedom, and the idea of self-purchase. So our first anti-slavery society will be established by Quakers in 1775. And then by the early 1800s, you will start to see a movement towards gradual compensated emancipation in states such as Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. So when we say compensated manumission or emancipation, it's going to be that the slave owners who free their slaves are then compensated financially for the loss of that slave. There will be an attempt to set up anti-slavery societies in the Upper South, but they were usually small and short-lived. And then in the Lower South, they're pretty much non-existent. Manumission, so the act of freeing a slave by a slave's master, they're going to be relaxed in some southern states. And for some that end up being free, they may go into what's called a self-purchase agreement. And also, sometimes masters would manumit slaves who were no longer profitable investments. So a self-purchase agreement could become an issue for African Americans. Sometimes they would use up all of their savings to buy their freedom. And then once they were trying to get on their feet, they didn't have the means to do so, and so they had to possibly go into debt to their former masters. And then the people who had loaned them money over time, they may decide to renege on that agreement and to bring that person back into slavery. So that sometimes it didn't always work out. There are going to be components after the American Revolution that will lead to maintaining slavery, one of which is going to come about in our U.S. Constitution. So our first government, the Articles of Confederation, is it's not going to go well. We don't have an executive branch. We don't have a judicial branch. You have to, all 13 states have to agree to change the Constitution, and 2/3 of the states have to agree to even pass a law. So this just didn't end up working out because they didn't have a strong central government. And a lot of this shows up after Shays' Rebellion. And the big issue from this is going to be, we didn't have a standing army. We didn't have a way to muster troops and get together to squash the rebellion. And this is going to kind of be a wake-up call for delegates to come together and create the Constitution. So some parts of the Constitution that have to do with slavery. So slavery is, the only way it's really addressed in the Constitution is having to do with the slave trade, and then referring to slave revolts and returning fugitive slaves. So the words slave and slavery are omitted from the Constitution. So there will be a clause to continue the slave trade for another 20 years. They wanted to get rid of it immediately, but there was pressure from South Carolina and Georgia, and they said that they still had a labor shortage and needed more slaves to help run their economy. So that stayed in there. Another provision is going to counteract slave rebellions and escape. So the Congress says it will put down insurrections and domestic violence. And it's going to also have verbiage that has to do with if there's somebody that's held in service or labor, a slave, if they're trying to escape, that they will do things to return that slave or laborer back to their master. So this is going to be we're going to see the first Fugitive Slave Act emerge from this verbiage. And then probably the most famous part of the Constitution that has to do with slavery is the Three-Fifths Compromise. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, one of the problems that came up during the Constitutional Convention is how do we get representation from each state? So we're going to have two houses in Congress, we're going to have the Senate, and their representation is going to be equal. So no matter what state you're from, you have the same number of senators. So Rhode Island has the same number of senators as Texas, for example. Then they want to also have there's going to be another House of Congress, that's our House of Representatives. House of Representatives, their representation is going to be based on population. So Texas has many more representatives than Rhode Island, for example, because we have more people. So then the next question became, how do we count slaves in our population? So let's look at what our populations are when they're making these decisions for the Constitution. So, for example, let's look at South Carolina. They have 247,000 people in their population, but 104,000 of them are slaves. So, but as we remember, slaves can't vote. They're considered property for the southern slave owners. But in this situation, they wanted to count them as people so that they could get more representatives. So they wanted to look at the 247,000 people, including the slaves, to figure out how many representatives they had and not subtract the 104,000 from it and only use the population of those that would be able to possibly vote. So they had to come up with a compromise. The compromise that they came up with was, we will count slaves as 3/5 of a person for representation. So for every 5 slaves that you had, 3 of them counted for population and 2 of them did not. So this was kind of an interesting conundrum, considering that Southerners often saw slaves as property and not people. But then when they wanted more representatives and more power in Congress, then they wanted the slaves to count as people. So now we're going to look at other factors that maintained slavery in this time. A big one is going to be the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. It was used kind of a series of combs to clean the seeds out of the cotton. This tended to be a very laborious process, and this is going to lead to cotton production rising exponentially in the United States. So we're going to go from 3,000 bales of cotton that are exported in 1790 to 178,000 bales that are exported in 1810. Each of those bales weighs 480 pounds, by the way. So cotton becomes our biggest export, and it's going to really fuel the plantation society, and it's going to encourage. So with all that cotton, now you got to make textiles or cloth out of it. So you're going to see a rise in textile mills in New England that needs the cotton from the South to make the textiles and fabric in the North. This is going to really reinvigorate the slave labor system in the South. It was starting to decline before this invention, and now it's just going to really explode. The next thing that's going to lead to expansion of slavery or keeping it in place is going to be the Louisiana Purchase, which was done in 1803. And the Louisiana Purchase, it's not just the state of Louisiana. It's going to be a swath of land that literally doubles the size of the United States. Now, we only have a law about the Northwest Ordinance with outlawing slavery in the territories, but not in this whole big new set of land that we're getting when we make this purchase with France. And so now we have a whole new set of land, quite a bit of it in the South, that is conducive to growing cash crops, and that's going to also help with expanding slavery. Also, after the American Revolution, that idea and those sentiments towards liberty and freedom for African Americans, it starts to fade over time. We're also going to see the mindset of conservatives in this time using race to justify slavery. We're going to see laws coming from Congress, such as the 1790 law that granted naturalized citizenship to, quote, any alien being a white person. We will see laws such as the one in 1792 that limited enrollment in militias to only white male citizens. There's still this block on the fear of arming African Americans. And so this mindset of seeing slavery being justified because many conservatives saw African Americans as inferior to white people, and this is going to continue that mindset of accepting slavery. We are also going to have an emergence of free African American communities during this time. A majority of them are going to be in the North. We will see the first group of what we call mutual aid societies. These will also be important later on, well into the 1800s. These societies were kind of like modern insurance companies and benevolent organizations. They would provide perhaps medical care or burial expenses. They would help support widows and children. We also had groups such as the Freemasons. We know that that was a major group amongst white Americans. There were also groups of African American Freemasons. And they're going to, it's kind of a secret society. It was a major movement during the late 1700s, early 1800s. Provided an opportunity for male bonding. They would dress up in fancy regalia. It would kind of give this prestige and a almost a hierarchy that attracted men of all races. So this was another group that came amongst free African American communities. During this time is when you will also see the emergence of the first independent Black churches. And these buildings would often also house schools, social organizations, and anti-slavery meetings. And after the Great Awakening, when you had groups that did allow churches, biracial churches, if you will, where there's going to be an immersion of white people denying African Americans influence in those churches. We will start to see more segregated seating, and then which will lead to forming separate African American congregations. And so this will end up leading to the rise of in those independent Black churches. Also in this time, African Americans will found their own schools, mostly because local white authorities would either refuse to admit African American children to public schools, or they only provided inadequate, separate African American schools. These schools did face a lot of difficulties because many African American families could not afford the fees. The schools would strain on meager resources. They would have to accept charity cases. Some African American parents believed education was pointless because African Americans could only get skilled jobs at this time. And many white Americans reacted negatively to African American schools. They feared competition of skilled African American workers, and they believed that African American schools would attract undesirable populations, and they feared that educating free African Americans might encourage slaves to revolt. So there are many African American leaders that emerged during this time. Most of them are members of the clergy. For example, Richard Allen, he will open a school for African American children in Philadelphia. He wrote against slavery and racial prejudice, and he made his home a refuge for fugitive slaves. Absalom Jones is going to, he often had a concern for fugitive slaves facing re-enslavement, and this led him to become the first African American to petition Congress. His petition later helped abolitionists with the argument that slavery violated the spirit of the Constitution and it should be abolished. Other leaders in this time would be Jupiter Hammond of Long Island and Daniel Coker of Baltimore, who is going to be he's going to also conduct a school, and he's going to found the AME Church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he's going to advocate for African American migration to Africa. John Chavis he served on the Patriot side of the war during the American Revolution, and he gained his reputation as a biblical scholar. And then Lemuel Haynes, who was the son of a white mother and an African American father. He served with the Minutemen and Continental Army. He spoke out against slavery, and in 1780 he became the first ordained African American Congregationalist minister, serving as a pastor to white congregations. So we're going to see that there's a lot of activism in this time. Some of it's going to be petitioning others. Some of it's going to be urging movement back to Africa. Some of it's going to be helping those in need. Some of the approaches we're going to see for the treatment of African Americans. Some are going to protest and petition to establish rights of African Americans as American citizens. Some are going to encourage migration from the United States to either Africa or the Caribbean, somewhere free from white prejudices to establish their own society. We will also see slave uprisings occur in this time. Probably the most famous one is going to be Toussaint Louverture. He leads the pretty much the only successful slave rebellion, and this is in modern day Haiti. So this becomes a big piece of inspiration for many slaves that hear about this rebellion. Another rebellion that happened during this time is going to be from a slave named Gabriel. And Gabriel he had a kind of a revolutionary idea. He wanted to pull together support from a few white people. Hopefully, some poor white people would rally to his cause, and they would then plan to kill those who supported slavery, take control of Central Virginia. Unfortunately, on the day of his uprising, two slaves did reveal his plans to white authorities, and those that were involved were arrested. And Gabriel was one of the last to be captured because he had help from a network of white allies. The group where it was Gabriel and 26 others were convicted of conspiracy and insurrection, and they were hanged. But this demonstrated that slaves could organize for a large-scale rebellion, and this is going to leave a legacy of fear among slaveholders and hope for liberation among Southern African Americans. So these uprisings are going to actually have an effect on white Southerners, where they're going to want to make slavery stronger and make it more restrictive of rights. One of the big events in this time period is going to be the War of 1812. This is often seen as the Second War for Independence, as it's between the British and the Americans. Some of the causes starting this war will be the practice of impressment. This is pretty much when British ships would take over American ships, kidnap American sailors, and force them to work on British ships. There was also a lot of interference in shipping, and there's going to be British encouragement of Native American resistance in the Northwest at this time. So as we're getting ready to fight, Southern states will refuse to enlist African Americans because of this ongoing fear of arming African Americans. When the British come in and invade in 1813, they're going to offer slaves freedom. And from the threat that the British bring to Philadelphia and New York, this is finally going to lead to having active African American involvement on the American side of the war. Two of the big battles that African Americans fought in are going to be in the Battle of Lake Erie, which is going to secure control of the Great Lakes for the United States. African Americans have always been a big part of the Navy, and even in this battle, a quarter of the leader of the Navy, Oliver Hazard Perry, a quarter of his sailors are African American. And he does praise their valor after this battle. Another battle that was very important for African American involvement in the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans. Now, this battle was fought a month after the peace treaty was signed, but as we know in this time period, it takes a really long time to get information from Europe over to America. So when this battle was fought, both sides did not know the war was over yet. And in this battle, we will have free African American militias that are going to be part of the battle. And General Andrew Jackson is going to even include one of these militia units in his force that defends New Orleans, and he offers the members equal pay and benefits. So there are at least 600 free African American men who fought on the American side in the Battle of New Orleans. And Jackson does live up to that promise of giving equal treatment. And later, Jackson does tell the president, James Madison, it was a choice between having free African Americans within our own ranks or going to the ranks of the enemy. And Jackson chose having them in our own ranks. So our last major topic for this chapter is going to be the Missouri Compromise. This is going to happen in 1820. So in 1803, we buy the Louisiana Purchase, which is pretty much all of this area I circled right here. So they're starting to organize them into states, and they want to decide, what do we do for deciding if something should be a slave state or a free state? So you have to remember, when we talked about the Constitution, one of the things that's very important at this time is they want to have the same number of free states as they do slave states, because that's going to keep the balance in Congress equal. So in the Senate, if you have 10 free states, you would also have 10 slave states. So you'd have the same number of senators for both sides. So if one side tries to pass a law that either abolishes slavery or expands slavery, it's most likely not going to pass, because you have the same number of free states as you do slave states. So in 1820, Missouri wants to become part of the Union. But if they do that, it's going to mess up the balance of free states and slave states. So they have to figure out, what are we going to do? So during this time, the state of Maine, it was originally owned by Massachusetts. It was a territory of Massachusetts. What they end up doing to keep the balance even is they make Maine a free state, and they say, okay, you can have Missouri as a slave state, but we're going to give you this line on the southern border of Missouri, and everything north of that line is going to be free. Everything south of that line is going to be slave. So remember, this line stops in 1820 right here. Texas doesn't come in until 1845. We don't get this area until 1848. So these parts are not in consideration when the Missouri Compromise was created. And so later on, what we're going to see is, do we expand this line all the way to the Pacific coast? Or do we get rid of it altogether? So this pretty much quells the argument for expansion of slavery for just a little while. This is that phrase we call kicking the can down the road. So we're going to kick this slavery issue down the road until we end up coming to the Civil War. So this compromise is very important when looking at, do we keep slavery going or do we stop it where we're at? And that will become a question for the next 30, 40 years of American history that we will study. So in conclusion, from this time period, we looked at what factors or forces after the American Revolution worked for African American freedom. We looked at what forces worked to keep slavery in place. We looked at characteristics of free African American communities. We identified African American leaders and some of the different ideas and solutions for problems African Americans faced. We looked at the African American role in the War of 1812, and we evaluated the Missouri Compromise's impact on African Americans.